Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and also for the opportunity to present my paper at this conference. It's kind of challenging being in such a great session here. And what I'm presenting here is basically the first part of my PhD project. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Regensburg. And the project is titled Labor Market Adjustments to Population Decline, a Historical Macroeconomic Perspective. And this is joint work with my supervisor, Enzo. So given the topic of the conference, I don't have to talk a lot about the basic motivation of this paper. So clearly we see in the economic literature that economic adjustments to population decline have seldomly been addressed. So the motivation and the goal of our paper is really to get first empirical evidence, first empirical idea of what is happening in periods when population is declining, what is happening in the labor market. Doing this initially is confronted with the question of data. So from national or macroeconomic perspective, and say from 2016 earlier, we do not have a lot of decline observation in the recent past. Contrarily, in the more distant past, so I really talk about more distant past, so this panel is starting in 1875. We have some observations, we have various observations distributed across a range of countries. Given this fact, the first major contribution of our paper was really to gather some data. So we constructed a new data set. So I spent more than one lockdown gathering new data on population and births, on GDP, on wages, on investments, employment, unemployment, the labor force participation rates, to cover or to create a data set on an annual basis from 1875 to 2016, and overall we are covering at the moment 9 countries, which you can see here on the bottom. So how do we make use of this data? We draw on the cross-country variation which we have in the data and specify a panel vector regressive model. And maybe just a warning, the next slide is going to be a little bit technical, and this is really just some ongoing work and preliminary results. But what we are using is a vector regressive model with our panel data. So we have on the left-hand side a vector of 6 endogenous variables. So basically we have 6 regression equations. This vector consists of the working age population, of GDP, of wages, investment, employment, and unemployment. And on the right-hand side, we of course have the lagged endogenous variables. We have individual fixed effects, country fixed effects, time fixed effects, and another vector which includes a vector of dummy variables which capture really the dynamics that happened during the world wars. So to analyze now the reactions to population growth and population decline requires a nonlinear framework. So currently this is linear, right? So we follow a strand of the literature which really combines vector autoregressive model with the idea of a smooth transition regression. So if you now look at equation 2 compared to equation 1, one crucial thing has changed. We now include the lagged endogenous variables 2 times to really get here in red 2 coefficient matrices. One is those for the dynamics during growth periods and one for the dynamics during decline periods. And how do we obtain that? By pre-multiplying the vector of endogenous variables with the probability of experiencing population decline in the respective year. How do we find this probability of experiencing population decline? We basically follow again the literature using this logistic transition function, where we use a transition variable which comes naturally as the annual population growth rate in our case. And we have 2 parameters which are really governing the transition between 2 states, so the decline state and the growth state. And the C parameter defines basically when this switch occurs, so really which breakpoint defines 2 different regimes. And in our case, this is of course 0 as we're interested in decline. And the other parameter, which is gamma, governs more or less the smoothness of the transition between growth and decline. So really capture also the dynamics which are happening at very low population growth and very low population decline as some kind of population stagnation. How do we find this last parameter? We basically match this or calibrate this parameter to match the share of the decline years in the overall sample. So now to get a more intuitive understanding of what this means for our data, I've now plotted here the decline probabilities for the countries in the data set. You can see the decline probabilities as the solid black line here in the graph. And what you can see as these orange shaded areas are the years in which the working age population in the respective country actually declined. And what we can observe is that our transition function basically pretty good resembles these decline periods. So we have a high decline probability in these years. And additionally, and that's the very motivation of smooth transition regression, is that we also have observations with really low population growth for many, many years in the far distant past. So having said that, we have found more or less our econometric model. We are deriving regime-dependent coefficient matrices, so coefficients for the growth times and coefficients for the decline times. And now we're interested what happens if the population receives an exogenous innovation, so an exogenous shock, and how does this shock is distributed through the labor market and through time. To do this, and this is very technical, so we'll be maybe not so specific here, but basically we're using the fact that the reduced form innovations can be expressed as a linear combination of structural shocks, and we're interested in structural shocks, so we're really interested in this exogenous increase or decrease of population. Instead of really finding a very sophisticated identification method, we apply something that has really grown in recent years. So we are, instead of identifying all the relationships in our model of 6 equations, we're just interested in how the population decline or growth is propagated through the system. So we really just identify a small vector S. And how do we find this vector? We basically apply a very common instrumental variable estimation. That is, we use the residuals of the 6 equations I've shown you before. We weight them by the respective probability of experiencing decline or growth, regressing them on a suitable instrument. You can see here a set that satisfies the usual conditions, so it must be relevant, it must be exogenous. And in a second step, we use the fitted residuals to really get the regime-dependent shock propagation of a population growth or population decline. What are the instruments we are using? We are using basically 2 instruments. One are the birth select 15 years ago, the other is the birth select 65 years ago. And this is basically inflows and outflows into and from the working age population. And we are allowing for different roles of these instruments for the different regimes. And we observe using this in the first stage regression, we observe F values of sufficient sizes, so we can really like continue with our estimation strategy. Maybe some final remarks on this estimation strategy. We specify our vector autoregressive model with 3 legs. We find this using common information criteria and checking for residual correlation. We use the estimation results in Bootstrap then to really obtain confidence intervals with 2000 draws. And additionally, as we've included 6 variables, we also derived the effect or the impact of a population growth shock or population decline shock on the labor force participation using the other effects, as we have included population, employment, and unemployment. So it's included implicitly, right? Okay, so having talked a lot about our econometric strategy, we can now turn to analyze some first very preliminary results. So if we turn to the next slide, what we can see here are impulse responses to a positive population shock in times of population growth. So as the dashed black line, you can see the point estimate, so the point estimate impulse response, and as the gray areas in the background, we can see the confidence intervals, which are 95% confidence intervals. And what we see here, and I can tell you, I didn't bring some linear estimations here because of time constraints, but the growth regime pretty much resembles what is happening if we just estimate the whole time period using a linear model. So the population is increasing. This means employment is increasing. This means, of course, that GDP is growing. Also, that unemployment is growing. The additional people not necessarily go proportionally into the labor market, so the participation is decreasing. Also, real wages are decreasing as we have more people in the labor market, and the investment is increasing, both absolute and relative. And this is now gets even more interesting if we compare this growth regime estimates to the decline regime estimates on the next slide. So what we can see here, first of all, is that the demographic dynamics following population shocks in both regimes are really similar. And based on that observation, we can basically, I would argue, observe three distinct adjustment patterns. The first adjustment is that is clearly in terms of labor supply. So employment is declining less strongly in the decline regime compared to the growth regime, at least in the point estimate. What we also can observe is that unemployment is declining more distinct in the decline regime compared to the growth regime, meaning that a lot of people are going out of the labor, out of the unemployment into employment, or is at least a feasible interpretation. And as a consequence of rather similar population dynamics, you also see that the labor participation rate increases in times of population decline, although this is not statistically significant compared to those estimates on employment and unemployment. But remember that we have derived this impulse response implicitly, so it's a rather broad construct. The second adjustment process we can observe here, I would argue, is investment. So while investment is really increasing in the growth regime, it's much less distinct decreasing in the decline regime, which means investments in absolute terms stays at a very similar level. And of course, given the decline in GDP, it's also the increases in relative terms, possibly indicating, for example, automation, so investment in automation and machines. And the third adjustment process, I would argue, we can observe here is in real wages, although it's the less distinct. We see that at least in the point estimate, the direction is much more distinct in the decline regime. But as you can see here, we have a lot of insecurity here in the real wages, and we have to really work on that further. So to sum up, the imminent or occurring working age population decline among advanced economies calls for a close investigation of labor market adjustments. To this end, we collected a new data set, which contains demographic and economic variables for 9 so-called advanced economies, or the period 1875 to 2016, from a large number of sources. And then we specified a smooth transition model to really get different results, different effects in growth and decline periods. And as I just said, I would argue that we can observe on the base of these preliminary results 3 adjustment patterns, which are labor supply for both higher participation and a reduction in unemployment in order to maintain the employment level, kind of a disproportionately less distinct decline in investment, but only weak evidence of increasing wages. I mean, clearly we are, first of all, in a very preliminary stage of our project. And on the other hand, we have some limitations built in the model and some tasks ahead to address. First of all, is the model specification. I think a crucial point or a crucial further variable to include would be ours to really see what the labor input reaction is. Here we are very constrained by historical data availability. Second is the nonlinear parameter constancies. So our adjustments back then similar to what they are now. We are really working on that, but again, we're really constrained by a very few number of observations. And the third one is, of course, the historical data quality, which always have to be kept in mind. So that was everything from my side. Thank you very much for your attention. Any ideas, comments, or suggestions to improve our very early project are, of course, highly welcomed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Timon.